All right, today I am delighted to be joined by Tamara Sanderson, who's the co author of a great new book called Remote Works. I think I've got it here. Managing for Freedom, Flexibility, and Focus. You should definitely read this if you manage remote or hybrid teams, although, frankly, I'd actually encourage any manager to read it. Tamara's got a diverse background. It includes Google and Automattic, which you might not know, but is actually behind about a third of the websites on the internet. Now, she's the co founder of Remote Works, an organizational design and consulting firm with a mission to liberate teams from the 9 to 5 and teach them how to do their best work anytime, anywhere. Company named after the book. Welcome to the podcast, Tam.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, that's great. So first off, I'd love to say that I'm a huge fan of the book. In fact, I'll show it again just in case anybody missed it there. So um, it's actually the book I kind of wish we'd written, but we didn't, and you did. So congratulations on that.
It's a very high of praise, and also, Paul, it takes a long time to write a book, so we're happy to do that for you.
Well,
Yes.
exactly, yeah. So we can at least recommend it to people. So there is a ton that I want to go through today with you. So let's just dive straight in. Um, I think I want to start with something that we've discovered in our own work, and you're clearly backing up in this book. Um, Managing remote or hybrid teams is different, and it needs a different set of skills. So, can you explain, based on your own experience, what is different about it beyond the blatantly obvious thing that people are either in office or out of office in the two modes?
Yeah. So when I think about this, is I actually became a remote worker before I knew it had a title, or that's what I was doing. So in 2006, I joined a consulting firm called Oliver Wyman. I was very quickly given a BlackBerry, which I think tells you a little bit about the time. No iPhone yet. I had an IBM ThinkPad, but I was traveling around all the time. So I was like in the movie Up in the Air, but there's no George Clooney. It was just me with a laptop going to different hotels. But it became very normal for me to be working with people that were not always co-located with me. And I just thought that was just how you do it. That is what consulting is. I later joined tech companies. So at Google, when I worked in Singapore, I was working with lots of different offices. We had a thing called GBC, which is kind of like Zoom, where we all had screens that we could talk to different offices in. But essentially, you're putting technology in the middle of how you work, and once you do that, you are removing the constraints that used to happen in the physical office. No longer do you have to work based on a commuting schedule. No longer do you have to work with people that are located within a 20-mile radius of each other. You can start working with people in different countries. You can work with different time zones. You can work in different styles. And once you open up those ways of working, it's just a completely new world. And so, what we've seen right now is a lot of copy and pasting, which is kind of like the first step of remote working. It's 101.
Hmm.
Yes, like you need to move from the physical office to being able to work in different locations. But once you really hone that technology and hone those skills, you start being able to work in a completely different way where you're like a lot more efficient and effective, and you can work when you have a lot of energy. You can better balance your personal life. And that's what gets me really excited about remote work.
Yeah, it's funny. Regular listens to the pod will know that what you just described as your life, you could be describing as mine. That was and since '94. I did a calculation recently, and since '94, I think I've spent 18 months in an office. And so the rest of it has all been out of there. And so I think that's something that people forget, which is that there are categories of people that have been doing this forever. And what's really interesting is that many of those people sort of don't even think about the skills that they've honed or developed over a period of time, but they are skills that they've honed and developed. And not everybody has those skills because they haven't had that lived experience in the same way that we have in our lives. Um,
Yeah.
and that creates challenges, of course, when it comes to managing these types of teams. And that's really the main focus on your book, which is really centered around managing these type of environments. I want to start there with the manager archetypes that you define. So can you just start by kind of walking me through what each of the manager archetypes are, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail on them.
Yeah. And so I think management, I'm glad that you brought that up. There's a reason why the subtitle of our book is Managing for freedom, flexibility, and focus, because what we're seeing is people are having less control, or at least less control than they're used to in the remote world. And that, I think, is ultimately what scares people about remote work. You can
Hmm.
come up with all kinds of intellectual reasons, but people are used to being able to see somebody. They're used to having somebody on kind of call for 8 hours a day
Hmm.
that they can see. And all of a sudden, when you remove those things, people feel like they have less control, even if that's not necessarily true, but it feels that way. And control is an ultimate human need. If you go into any wisdom tradition, like Buddhism is all about kind of not having as much control, reducing attachment. So it is completely normal to feel that way. And you can take baby steps to start feeling like, yes, I can manage for this. I can feel like I have a sphere of control. And I can give other people autonomy, because by having complete control over somebody else, it means that they don't have control over their own lives. And so, what I think
Hmm.
remote work does, it raises the autonomy for everyone so that they feel like they have more control over kind of their own worlds. But yeah, so the way we think about the archetypes, we ended up having, like, in the book, there's kind of like fun characters that stand for those. And so we use musicians just to get away from, business jargon and business speak and have people think of a different metaphor. But essentially, it's a two by two, like any like good ex consultant likes to put things in. But essentially, like one axis is thinking as a manager, are you more organizational or external facing, or are you team facing? So, for example, if you're org facing, your primary thing might be managing upward and outward. You may be talking on a daily basis to people that are not within your team. You may be very cross functional. If you're team focused, your day to day is going to be kind of looking at your team. You're going to know a lot of the details and the ins and outs of the content that they're working on. And so that's the first axis. The second axis is, as a manager, are you super hands on or are you hands off? And so a hands on manager might be a little bit more kind of micromanagey. It doesn't have to be, but you're going to be a lot more in the weeds. You're going to be a lot more in the details. You're going to be in all those meetings. If you're more hands off, you allow people different autonomy. And so with these archetypes, we kind of think that people naturally kind of gravitate towards one, but we recommend flexing based on the scenario. So let's imagine you have a very junior team. They are right out of undergrad or right out of high school, and this is their very first job. So if that is true, then you probably want to be a bit more hands on. You're going to want to be more of a coach, more of a mentor. They don't necessarily know like what work is, right? But if you are managing a team of like people that have been in the industry for 20 years and maybe they're all like excellent salespeople, like give them the autonomy, be hands off, let them do their craft, and you can manage something else. And so I do think you flex based on the scenarios. And within the book, we give tips on, this is what it looks like in a remote context. Here's when to flex to this type of role, etc. And so that's what we think about management styles. And I always think it's nice to be able to. I'm a huge Myers Briggs fan, and I like
Hmm.
Enneagram. I like anything Jungian psychology. So I find this stuff really fun because you can kind of take a little quiz in our book and see where you naturally lie. Um, I am much more of a band leader, which means I tend to be team focused and hands off. And so I love to set people up, let them kind of like, I usually am often a contributor in it. I know a lot of content that's going on, but I love for people to have autonomy and I trust people to work at their best.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love about these archetypes, you mentioned that people fit into these different categories. You call them, by the way, composer, band leader, agent, and promoter. As you mentioned, the musical references, which I think is great, and also allows people very instinctively to kind of understand what the different archetypes are. When we first started working with managers, it was interesting because we were trying to figure out how much should we prescribe, what type of manager is the right type of manager to be in a remote organization, and then also what does it um, what does it mean if you are naturally one type, and does that mean that you're more predisposed towards remote work or hybrid work than otherwise? And what we found, I think, was similar to you, which is on the second question, the answer is sort of yes, to a certain extent, in the sense that if you are a manager who typically tends towards micromanagement, then you can find managing in a remote or hybrid environment more difficult than you would in in other environments. Now, in most cases, micromanaging isn't a good idea anyway, right? So that you probably should be working on, but
Yeah,
it can kind of
exactly.
expose that a little bit more if you're working in a remote setting. So to that extent, we thought the answer was sort of yes. But then, as you rightly point out, people naturally gravitate towards these types of management styles. And as long as there is a match between the type of management style that you have and the way that the people that are you're managing want to be managed, there's no issue. And that's what I love about what you get into the second piece of this, which is effectively what you're saying is that understand what you are, right? The self discovery of kind of understanding what you naturally are, but having the flexibility to be able to adjust that style according to the needs of the people that you're managing. I think it's really smart insight.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it kind of brings me back. I spent 1 year in private equity before leaving and joining Google. I was not the best fit for that environment. It's like you work 80, 90 hours a week. It's very, very detailed. But I remember starting and we all took a Myers-Briggs and they said, you need to have this very specific personality type to succeed here. You need to be ENTJ. And they were like, if you are not, you're not going to be a fit. I definitely don't have those letters. And so I remember thinking like, wow, that feels like a loss that you can only have one type of person succeed in an organization. And really what it depends on fit. And so it might not be a fit within a certain team, but it could be a fit in another one. And so
Mhm.
I'm all about like, how can it's all, it depends if it's going to work. And that's why there's a lot of, I don't know, there's artistry to, I think, creating teams. It's not necessarily all scientific.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's build on this these management archetype concepts. Um, and let's go into a little bit more detail in one specific area that you talk about in the book, because I think it will help people understand just how different remote and hybrid environments are to full in office environments. You've got a chapter you call the ABC of remote communication, but you mean something specific by ABC. What is that?
Yeah, so ADC stands for async before calls. And async is kind of the bread and butter of remote work. It sounds like a very technical term, but essentially, asynchronous communication means later communication. And we practice async communication all the time. We just don't know it. But that is how you make remote work because you're not always going to be synchronously available. You're not always going to be online at the exact same time. And you have to allow people to have messages so that they can complete tasks at different times of the day.
It's really interesting because I think a lot of times managers, teams, companies haven't fully yet internalized that very very simple concept. And what it boils down to is that it's it becomes one of the critical ways in which managers fail to get the best out of their remote and hybrid teams. So what we've seen before is um, a lot trying to replicate what went before. So in other words, they potentially have some experience of managing in a traditional office, or at the very least, they've been managed in a traditional office. So they've got kind of a sense as to what they feel that management looks like. And then what they attempt to do basically is do that replication. So your in-person meeting becomes your Zoom meeting. Your ad hoc collaboration becomes an ad hoc Zoom meeting, and so it's really interesting to see that when it's not done well, you can kind of feel it inside an
You get really
organization. But when it is
tired.
done
You
well,
see yourself
it's
all the
different.
time,
Yeah.
Zoom, so I feel like people have never, like, looked at themselves as much in their entire lives. You get a
Uh-huh.
lot of fatigue, and you're looking at a screen all day, and that's actually, like, part of the reason why Allie and I wanted to write this book is because when I was at Automattic, I was almost never on Zoom. It
Mm.
was a very primarily written communication. I could be anytime. I didn't have to do a lot of calls unless they were external. And that was my experience of remote work. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, I have so much freedom. I was traveling around. I was working at my own time schedule. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. I have so much freedom. And then I went to a very cool in person creative agency, IDEO, known for design thinking. And I
Mhm.
was there in the Cambridge studio for about 6 months. The pandemic happens, and then we're all at home, and we were all on Zoom all the time and doing kind of creative things. But I remember being like, wow, this is really, really, really tough for me to stay online and to stay focused. It is really not how I enjoy working. And I think that's just the first step of remote work. There is kind of, I think actually Matt Mullenweg, who wrote the foreword of our book, who's the founder of WordPress and Automattic, he talks about kind of like almost like a Maslow's pyramid, but
Mhm.
of autonomy. And so the first one is that you can like start working from home. Great. Like there's some jobs you can't do that. You can't be a nanny working remotely. Let's be honest. Like that would be
Mhm.
a really bad thing to leave a 2-year-old with somebody on a screen. But, once you start being able to work remotely and in a different location, that's kind of phase 2. But when you're at 5, you can be working with people at any time and there's no slowing down, and you can have kind of a global workforce that is working 24 hours. They're working on different shifts, and you don't have to do all this kind of synchronous communication all of the time. And so it really kind of opens you up to be able to live and design your best work life.
Yeah, I love that as a model. We use for those people that are regular listeners to the podcast and we're familiar with our space and time concept. We did our own 2x2. There you go. So it
Oh,
basically
yeah.
almost the same things, isn't it? Right. And so we did a 2x2 based on basically space and time um, to identify jobs that need to be co-located in space and time. Ones that need to be co-located in time, ones that need to be co-located in just space,
Uh-huh.
and then finally ones that don't have to be co-located in either, right? But it's much the
Yeah.
same. It's much the same principle, and it really does start to help people to think that these things are different. Your story about Automattic and your story about, sorry, remind me the name of the studio.
IDEO.
Idea, yeah. So it's really
IDE.
yeah. So it's really really interesting because um, what you've described there is that both of them, when in their natural habitat, were thriving, right? And so when you're at Automatic, right, it's a habitat that has been designed, a remote work environment that is designed to thrive in that setting, and then a studio whereby everything has been optimized for the fact that people are physically co-located at the same time. And then you try if you tried to flip either one of those to a different environment, take either of those fish out of water, then that's when you start to struggle. And it really
Ex uh
highlights how different they are, doesn't it?
Yeah, and just to give kind of the counter example, when I was at Automattic, I was leading a partnership between WordPress and Google.
Mhm.
Google is a very meeting-centric culture, and so every time I would try to get like Automatic engineers and be like, hey, we're going to talk to the engineers at Google. We're going to talk about this integration that we could do. And like the automaticians would be like, I hate being in meetings. Please, please stop putting this on my calendar. And so we had to come up with a way to do kind of asynchronous communication. But, where that friction happened was trying to combine two very different working cultures into a project together. And so yes, fish out of water. And I love your 2x2. That's a great way to start also thinking about how you can kind of unlock some of the benefits of remote work, because you
Mhm.
can see where you actually stand. And if you're not in that, we have to be at, aligned on time and aligned on space, then you start being able to play in that remote world.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's get into the a little bit more of the detail on the asynchronous piece then. So, as you mentioned, right, this idea of figuring out how to or doing asynchronous work, and the fact that we all do it might make it seem very simple. Just switch what you do synchronously to doing it asynchronously. But of course, as we've just described, organizations and teams can actually struggle with this quite a bit. So let's start with I don't know skills that you need. Obviously, it sounds like, for example, you're using a lot more in the way of written communications versus real time verbal communications. Is that right?
Uh, Yes, and
Good.
is gonna be my answer to that. So first things first, I think a lot of people confuse tools with asynchronous communication. So just because you're using Slack or because you're using Zoom or something that is where technology is the middleman, that does not actually mean you're being asynchronous.
Hmm.
If you are typing rapidly back and forth, or people are expecting you to respond immediately on Slack or immediate to email, you are synchronous. If we're both like, we are in very different locations, but we are completely synchronous right now because
Hmm.
we are talking at the same time. So, our spaces may be different, but our times are the same.
Hmm.
And so I think that's the first thing. It can be written, but actually, asynchronous communication can be also verbal. And so, a way that I like to remind people is, okay, stop thinking about work, start thinking about your personal life, think about social media, think about news.
Hmm.
If you are on TikTok, whenever somebody recorded something on TikTok, unless it's live, you're watching it later. Any type of later communication is asynchronous. If you are going on Facebook or you're going on Instagram and seeing a picture of somebody on holiday or an update on somebody's kids, whenever they post it is usually different than when you're commenting on it. And so we actually have a lot of these asynchronous skills that we've been learning in the last 15 years through all these things that have happened with like internet technology. We're just not used to putting that at work. So, yes, I worked at WordPress. It's a blogging culture. Matt, the founder, loved writing, he loved blogging. I wrote a book. Obviously, I love writing too. It was a very natural fit. I was a fish in my water. I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. Please let
Hmm.
me just write everything. But that might not be the same. I was actually talking to a friend that does a lot of remote consulting, and she used to actually work at Automattic, and she moved to another company, and they hated written communication. And so
Hmm.
everything was in kind of short Loom videos.
Hmm.
So they would do 1 or 2 minute videos and they would share those. But I think the key thing is that later communication. And so that is what kind of asynchronous means. And just also keeping a whole, you want to document as much as possible. And so when I think about the old world, people used to kind of mention like, oh, knowledge is king, or we care a lot about our intellectual capital. But if you really go into any organization, usually like only a few people were in the meeting room, people were not taking notes, everybody forgot about it, and it just kind of like disappeared. And so that is how people were managing their intellectual capital. When you do remote work, you should be kind of de facto documenting. So if you are writing at the same time that you're communicating, that means you're kind of two birds, one stone. Or if you're making kind of Loom videos, etc. And so I think that's a really valuable process because you're automatically creating an artifact. But when we think about asynchronous communication, we really like to focus on this thing called the 4 Ws.
Hmm.
And that is how you can make asynchronous communication really robust. And at the same time, you're being incredibly intentional. You're thinking about the deliverables. It's all these things that are just like good 101 effective communication, regardless if you're remote or not. And we tried to do everything as simple as possible. So, ABCs, we'll talk about the only asynchronous lesson you need to learn.
Hmm.
But with these 4 Ws, it's basically who. So, if you're writing or you're talking, you need to address your communication to somebody. I don't know if you've ever been on Slack or email when it's like, hey guys, hey all, and it's like, who is all? Especially if you have like 30 people CC'd on an email, you need to like, who is the directly responsible individual? Who are you expecting a message back from? Because without that, there's a lot of kind of confusion. Second is what. That is giving context. And so if you are working in an environment that's good at documentation, maybe you create different links and you're like, hey, you can read the background of this decision. It's documented here. Or you can say, like, in our book, we have TLDRs for every chapter, but that's too long, didn't read. Like, just give like a 2 or 3 sentence summary of what you've been up to, and then people can, dig in deeper if they want to. But you want to get people up to date and have that context because we're context switching all the time. I don't like to. It's like not that great for my mind. I have ADHD, so context switching is not. I guess I'm naturally probably doing it all the time, anyways. But doing it even more is actually like a real struggle. But we are context switching, so you want to get people to get up to date as soon as possible. You don't want people to have to do all this guesswork of like, what is this person talking about? Why do they need me? What is this? So that's the what. Then the when, and that's like, when do you need a response by? When do you need somebody to read this information? And so make sure you use time zones when we're working in this like new environment. Don't say like end of day ASAP, because like what does that mean? When is your end of day, especially if you're working non-linearly? ASAP, like really let's think about what is super critical. Like most of us work in some type of like corporate business world. We are not ER physicians. Like,
Hmm.
let's be real. There's some things that are ASAP, but the majority of things are not, especially if they're planned correctly. Usually ASAP is almost a bug, not a feature. It means that you were not very intentional earlier.
Hmm.
And then the fourth W is it's I guess this would be kind of in the Urban Dictionary, but the way you would say it is like wah wah. It's
Hmm.
like, what do you do if like nobody responds back? And
Hmm.
so I think this is actually the biggest holdup and why people don't like to do asynchronous communication, because you can't make somebody read it immediately. You can't say like, I need your answer right now. That's what's nice about synchronous communication is you kind of have that forcing function. But with asynchronous, if you say, okay, I need this response by 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday from Allie, who's my co-writer, who's the directly responsible individual. If I do not hear back from Allie, this is how I'm moving forward, even without her response. And that kind of gives you the room to continue doing your work and continue to move forward without trying to hurt all these cats or feeling like you're blocked all the time. And so we really recommend if you just keep those four W's in mind, you're going to start having much better communication. And it sounds really simple, but if you actually look at most of your communication, I would guess that a lot of those are missing on a pretty regular basis. And so you can just be a lot more effective that way.
Yeah, there's so much in that answer you gave us there. I think that one of the more interesting ones is that when it really boils down to it, you're encouraging people to be much more deliberate in their communication, much more precise in their communication, whatever the mechanism is. And I think it's really important that you called out those distinctions because when we've worked with both individuals and managers, some of them, frankly, are a little bit afraid because they don't think of, for example, written communication as being their strongest suit, right? And they're super worried about the fact that they've always been able to thrive in an environment where they've been able to use other forms of communication. Um, and now it appears as though that's really the only form of communication they have left. But that's not the case at all. And in fact, previously on the pod we had Phil Libin, who is the CEO of I don't know if you know them as an organization, but they're basically specialists in video communication that is, I would say, like high sort of allows you to make your own mini movies really well in a very, very engaging way. And it would be wrong to sort of call it Loom Plus because it's not really that, but it allows you to be able to use it synchronously and asynchronously in and create really, really efficiently these forms of communication, then integrate those forms of communication with other technologies. And I think that you're now starting to see, for example, even in LinkedIn, people leave quick audio messages for each other inside LinkedIn. So people are starting to realize that there's asynchronous and synchronous, and then there's written and verbal and video and all and kinds of things, and those both exist, and you can use whatever works for you well. But the key is you need to be more deliberate in your communication. And then I wanted to touch on another piece because I think it's super important as well. Um, you mentioned how it can be frustrating because you don't have like the person right there next to you that you're asking to do something about. And what we've seen though is that that's an illusion of security. It's not actually security because what happens in real life when you're in person with somebody, they're not generally doing the work in the moment. All they're doing is saying yes in the moment. And and whether they actually do the work or not is something that is entirely different. And so this kind of deliberate communication actually allows you to be able to insert a level of accountability. As somebody put it to us recently, it's like if you were sat right opposite somebody and you said, can you do this for me? And I need it by 3:05 Pacific on Thursday, and it needs to look like this, and it needs to be in this way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People are like, whoa, that feels like a huge amount of when it's in person, feels like a huge amount of micromanaging. Whereas in reality, what you're doing is just being precise about your communications. But when you write it down, the thing that was something that just felt intrusive and over the top is now clarity, right? It's now allowing me to be able to prioritize appropriately and move things around and have a conversation about reprioritization if I'm not able to get it done by the particular time that I was able to. So a lot of it's about like perspective, but that clarity of communication can be easier in a situation where you're async and can actually result in getting things done more effectively over time once you're used to it. But you have to get used to it.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that it's an illusion because I think that's true. So much of this is about emotions and behavior change, which is tricky and has to do a lot with our human psychology. I often like to use this kind of model of thinking about high school versus college. And so
Hmm.
in high school, at least in American high schools, it's like butts in seats, 40 hours a week. You go from one class to the other and you have somebody watching you, right? And like
Yeah.
the teacher's there and you have to do certain things, right? And then when you go to university, for the most part, you start working on a much more asynchronous level. It's much more
Hmm.
deliberate. You're given a syllabi, like the first day of school. These are the books we're going to read. Here's the dates, the 5 exams that we're going to have. You have to write this one paper. They set those expectations, but you're not having a professor call you all the time being like, hey, are you working right now? Hey, what are you doing? Hey, hey, hey. Like that would be very annoying. And so it's weird that we regress to a high school mode after we graduate. And so I really encourage people to think of themselves if they're a manager more kind of like a professor and how can you lay those out? And I think you mentioned sometimes it can feel like when you're usually like the asynchronous communication is going to be longer. It can kind of feel like, oh, feels too formal or it
Hmm.
feels like too micromanaging. But by giving those expectations and that clarity up front, you remove having to have all of those other conversations later. Like instead, you can have it all at once and you can give them kind of the deliverable and then let them work versus like giving them little updates every day or every hour, every 30 minutes, which actually ends up to be a
Hmm.
lot more communication. And as you were speaking, I wanted to kind of bring up this is one of my favorite quotes. And it came from, I had an awesome coach who I got to interview for a book that he is the head of coaching at Automattic, Akshay. And his quote is from Viktor Frankl. And this really helped me start thinking about how to allow that space to happen for remote communication. He says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so
Hmm.
often we can feel very triggered. You get like a notification, a message, your Slack turns green, like stuff like that. And you feel like, oh, I've got to respond, I got to respond, I got to respond. But by feeling like you always have to respond, you're always on. And then you're not necessarily being deliberate and you're not making a choice anymore. By like allowing that space to happen, and allowing to choose your response and all then instead of always feeling stimulated, you just have a lot more control and a lot more power over your own workflow, which I think is really important, and that actually is in the sphere of your control.
Yeah. Very, very important. Very important. Thank you. That was really, really interesting and thought provoking. Um, there's a nuance that you get into the book, and this is going to seem like way down in the weeds, but hopefully our audience will figure out why, because we've talked about some of these issues before. Um, you mentioned the only asynchronous lesson you'll ever need that is in the book, and I would recommend people go through that in a little bit of detail because it almost like acts like a work example of a lot of the concepts that you're outlining the rest of that chapter, and to a certain extent the rest of the book as well. But in there, um, you talk about a specific example where somebody is communicating information, and it goes into the W's that you mentioned before. But you also alluded to the tool, and I thought this was really interesting, right? So in this fictional company that you're describing, they have Asana, which some of our listeners I'm sure will be quite familiar with, and they have Slack. And in the example initially where the user's doing it wrong, they mention it in they issue their communication in Slack, and then ostensibly you kind of correct them and show that they should have been using it in Asana. Now, I think for many people listen to that, they'll be like, well, hang on, how can a choice of tool make a, make much of a difference, especially as these concepts are ostensibly tool agnostic? So, can you go into just a little bit of a reason why a choice of tool in a scenario when you're communicating with others can make a difference in terms of the effectiveness of the communication?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts of this. One actually relates to our earlier chapter on setting up a digital house, and it is to
Mm-hmm.
have kind of a place. So, when you're in an office, you're like, okay, cool. I go to this meeting room and I have this meeting. I go to my desk, I write emails, I go to the kitchen, I gossip, like whatever it is, based on spaces. Then you go to your computer and we're in this remote world and everything is now on a 13-inch screen. And you're like, oh,
Mhm.
where is everything? And that's why it's really important to use location tools or cues. And so even if you look, there's a reason it's called the desktop. There's a reason why you
Mhm.
like remove files in a little thing that looks like a trash can, right?
Mhm.
And so when we're talking about like, being very specific on should it be in Slack or Asana, a lot of it has to do with location. It would be almost like if you didn't tell them where to communicate, it would be almost like having a meeting in a large office building and just saying like, hey, we're going to meet in 5 minutes and not telling anybody where it's at.
Mhm.
That would be, you would have people show up at all different places. And then all
Mhm.
of a sudden, everything gets really untidy. I'm doing a Marie Kondo, a really extreme one in my apartment right now. And I own like honestly thousands of books. I have basically my apartment is a library meets an art studio. But like without that categorization, everything gets really confusing. And so that is a part of like why we added it there. It's kind of that context of like when if you're the directly responsible individual, when you have communicated this, where should it be and where can you find it? And
Yeah.
so part of that is just based on being able to locate that information. But then I do think certain tools are better for certain types of communication. And so, Asana is primarily a project management tool. It's great for documentation, it is great for complexity. Slack, on the other hand, is good for kind of like quick conversations, etc. And so within an organization, you usually want to create some type of simple rule on when to use what tool. And so let's take an example. When I was at Automattic, you definitely had Slack and you also had WordPress blogs. And so Slack was for kind of casual conversation where anything that needed to be documented or should live on or would be kind of almost determined in the real world as like, let's call a big meeting about this. Then it had to be on a blog post. And you have to enforce those rules. So, as an example, I came from Google. I love Google Docs. I would have sneaky Google Docs sometimes when I was at WordPress. Then the CEO found out I had these sneaky docs and he pinged me and was like, hey, you're not allowed to do that. You have to put it in the Google in a blog post. Like we don't have sneaky random documents. And so, when the CEO tells you that, you usually like nod and agree. And all of a sudden
Mhm.
I, got rid of those sneaky Google Docs and I had everything posted immediately on WordPress blogs. But that is because, people would not be able to easily search for my Google Docs. That was something where I was like falling outside of the lines of the communication and what tool to use. And so it sounds really prescriptive, but if you don't just follow those very simple rules, things become incredibly chaotic of not being able to find any information in a remote world.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I think you highlight something that a lot of people won't necessarily have internalized quite yet, which is the relationship between transparency and almost like completeness of IP inside an organization, and then the opportunity that exists to use this technology in such a way that you are actually building up a true reflection of all of the work that people are doing. And so when we talk about transparency, we often talk about it in two realms, right? Number one, transparency can suffer inside remote centric organizations because the natural sort of communication mechanisms like that oh, I can just wander over or I can grab a group of people and bring them together in a room ad hoc. Those things are just a little bit more difficult inside a remote environment. And when transparency suffers, often trust suffers. But the flip of that is that if you fully embrace these technologies and you stay out of communicating or out of documenting in a closed environment and start communicating in an open environment, now you have the ability to be able to unlock all of this creativity that's happening inside people's brains. And you're able to do things like look at half completed things and collaborate on half completed things together and not just do too much work in your own head before anybody else does a sanity check on it. What we find, and this is a personal thing for me, right? Grabbing a Google Doc is super easy, right? And so you just you don't have to think about where to put it. You're just like, oh, I've got a thought, create doc, start writing. And so this can be a really difficult habit to get out of. You have to kind of train yourself out of that habit. Um, I'm guessing you had to as well, right? I mean, it probably wasn't immediately. Oh, boss said I
Definitely.
shouldn't
And
do this.
Even now, like, I run my own business with Allie, and I even noticed I still have a propensity to use Google Docs with her, and she's like, you need to document that in Asana, put that in the description section. Like, Google Docs we use for these certain things. We wrote our book in Google Docs, but when we're doing more business-oriented things, it needs to be in Asana.
Yeah.
And by following the simple rules and keeping ourselves accountable, it makes it much easier to find later because you can use the search function and you can be like, oh yeah, I had that conversation like 5 months ago. Great. I'm so glad I have the notes to like remember what we were talking about. But yeah, you have to kind of follow those things or else it's just going to be information overload. Like you'll never be able to find anything if you don't have some type of system in order.
Yeah, it actually came up on one of our previous episodes, and we were talking about this idea of balancing me versus we. And really, when you're grabbing that doc for yourself, right, you're focusing on your own needs to be able to get things done super super fast, but you're doing it at the expense of the need for the broader organization. And so sometimes you have to catch yourself around that. All right, let's wrap up here. So writing a book, I know because I've written I've written a few. It's always a journey. I'd love to know, as you were researching this topic more deeply, what has changed in for you, and what was the most surprising thing for you? What was the thing that when you started this, you kind of felt that one thing was true, and then coming out of it in terms of the research of your book, you thought, "Oh no, I had that wrong." So, what changed in your own behavior, and or what was a thing that just really surprised the heck out of you?
Yeah. Ooh, this is a good question and very fun that you've also written books. It's like such a process, so I would love
Oh
to
yeah.
talk about that separately with you another time, not here, but, so one thing is we interviewed about 35 other remote experts and got their stories. What was nice is you never know when you go through that process, but they actually synthesize towards very similar principles. So that was actually really nice to see that even if you work for very different organizations, that a lot of those kind of ladder up together. The thing I would say though is you can have two really great remote cultures and they can operate very differently.
Yeah.
So I notice that sometimes when Allie and I come to the table, she comes from DuckDuckGo, which was
Mhm.
like a very kind of like prominent all remote company before the pandemic. I come from Automattic. We both have our like ways of how we like to work remotely, but they are different. And so just because there's really not one right way to do remote work, there's a million ways to do remote work. And so finding like what works for your team and the individuals and kind of like all the different components of it is really important. So that surprised me is that the principles are all the same, but how that actually looks in your day-to-day work can be very different. That would be number one. Number two, I had a lot of thoughts on how remote works, but again, like until you make it transparent or visible or verbalize it, you don't even know. And so by coming up with a whole structure for our book, it was really nice to be like, oh yeah, this is what I've been doing these like last 15 or 17 years. I just didn't really realize it until I put it in written form that this is how remote work actually works. And that was really nice. And it actually required kind of a partnership because Allie and I have very complementary skill sets. And so being able to there you have to kind of diverge and converge on a lot of ideas. So diverging would be like interviewing 35 different people and all of these different inputs on like what makes remote work interesting and all these possible stories and all these concepts. And then you have to synthesize it so it actually makes sense and it ladders up to a structure. And Ali, I would say, is probably a better synthesizer, and I'm very divergent in thinking. And that was just a really helpful process because it allowed us to really solidify all these things that we innately knew, but hadn't necessarily made external before. So think that surprised me. And then a very, very personal note, going through this process, we interviewed this awesome professor at Berkeley. She does a lot on chronotypes, but we actually have different biological rhythms. And so she has a quiz that we took, and I think somebody won the Nobel Prize for chronotypes in like 2017.
Mhm.
So it is kind of a scientific concept that has gained popularity recently. But there's essentially three types. You have somebody that might be AM shifted, that's about 25%. You have PM shifted, that's about 20%. And then the majority of people, about 50%, are biphasic. So they have two humps throughout the day. And what I realized, and I always innately knew this, but I always felt kind of bad about it, is I don't know. Hopefully, you don't ask me this on this podcast, but people are always like, "What's your morning routine? Like, do you wake up at 5 a.m.? Are you having coffee and doing your run and then meditating?" And like, that is not me at all. I like love sleeping. I love a late wake up. I am not a morning person. And if I look back at a lot of my work life, is I was on a 6 a.m. red eye flight every Monday when I was in consulting. When I worked at Google in San Francisco, I was on a 6 a.m. bus down to Mountain View, and I felt horrible all the time. And I was like, I felt literally sick, both from commuting and I get car sick, but also just from like it not being aligned to my rhythm. I am PM shifted, which actually means that the first like peak that I have when I'm the most productive is actually 5 to 7 p.m. And so that's actually the end of people's natural workday. And then I get another peak at about 11 p.m. to about 1 in the morning. And so once I realized that, I actually like further shifted into my biological rhythm, and I wake up a lot later, I go to bed a lot later, and I work at very different times, and it's just I just feel better. I feel like more energized, but also just healthier, and I don't feel kind of tired and run down like I used to. And so that personally surprised me, because there was like a scientific basis for this thing that I had felt, but that complaining about like having to wake up felt like not an adult thing to do. Like my parents were like, "Oh, whatever," like, "Ooh, you have to wake up." But now I realize why it is important to work at when you're most productive. There's a McKinsey study that said if you work at your peak hours, you can finish things 5 times as fast.
Mhm.
And that is a huge key to unlocking your productivity. If in 1 hour at your peak time, it would take you 5 hours to do the same task at another time. And so that really opened my eyes to redesigning the way I work.
All right. Well, we will leave it there from one PM shifted person to another. Appreciate that. And and once again, the book is called Remote Works: Managing for Freedom, Flexibility, and Focus. As I mentioned, definitely do go ahead and buy this. It is a great synopsis of all of the things that we've covered on this entire series of the podcast, and also gives you a really, really, really good understanding if you're a manager of how to do this, and even if you're not a manager, how to manage it in the context of your own life. I think is there's some really, really useful information there. So thanks once again, Tam. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.